Well, this is an interesting way to get inspiration for a video. I dreamt of having a debate with somebody defending skimpy male bikini armor, and then I woke up remembering, wait a moment, didn't Shad make a video about this topic? It's a video from 2017, so this is not exactly a prompt response, but hey, I'm in the mood for it, so let's just go for it. And first, let me just point out that although there's going to be a lot of nerdy overanalyzing for fun and a bit of education, this is not intended to be confrontational or disrespectful to either Shad or fantasy artists or anyone else, really. And let me also point out that my straight male brain definitely can't deny the aesthetic appeal of designs like this. I can still find them kind of silly.
If you have a problem with this type of barbarian, the female fantasy barbarian, you should then also have a problem with this type of barbarian.
Yes, I do actually. For the same reasons, which I'll go into. By the way, personally, I don't care about the modesty angle at all. Now, there are valid points to be made about sexual objectification versus power fantasy, but that's getting too borderline political for my taste, at least on this channel. Like Shad pointed out, different cultures have different standards, and the fashion sense in a fantasy world may be very much unlike ours. There's really only one thing I'll say in this direction. It makes sense for a barbarian culture to take pride in physical prowess and to show off their imposing gains. So what's up with that?
Where are they?
Muscles are useful in a battle, no doubt about it. These are not. In fact, a set of big jiggly knockers can limit the range of motion and be a hindrance in combat. Yet female barbarian physique is often shown as not physically imposing at all. They don't even look like they train. So if I had to fight a barbarian to the death, guess which of these two I'd choose as my opponent? The Diablo 3 female barbarian, on the other hand, looks strong and mean. Here's a convincing warrior physique, much more believable than a skinny bikini model. Now, if you want to emphasize lifting power, there you go. Now, inevitably, now there will be people saying, there's dragons and magic, and this is what you find hard to believe? Well, yeah. If there's an explanation for it, like for example, women are imbued with magic that increases strength without increasing size, okay, fair enough. Otherwise, in this fantasy world, clearly muscle size means strength, as shown by male barbarian physique. So if you want to have internal consistency, muscle equals power, then female barbarians should also be somewhat muscular, maybe even more so than real-life people on this planet. Of course, it is still fantasy, and artists are free to draw or render whatever they like, the same way that I'm free to point out that it looks a little silly to me. Does that sound fair to you? Alright, here's where the overanalyzing starts. Having acknowledged that fantasy is fantasy and can do whatever it wants, let's still talk about how realistic it would be in real life, or in a more mundane world, what have you. Now, one of the points of fighting without armor is, of course, to show fearlessness. And Shad mentioned that certain Celtic warriors went into battle naked. Now, Polybius describes the Gallic Gaisatae as fighting without clothes, wearing only a shield and weapon. That's a way to show bravery and fighting spirit, obviously, and also an attempt to intimidate the enemy. Although I would say there's a big difference between fighting naked behind a large shield that covers most of your body and fighting mostly naked with some patches of fur and bits of metal here and there while dual-wielding axes, which aren't exactly known for their great defensive capabilities. Shad made the point that although armor is not as restrictive as some think, it's still obviously worse than light or no armor. Armor and especially helmets can make it harder to breathe and do restrict the range of motion to an extent, and of course they add a lot of weight that you have to move around that will tire you out more quickly. But why would you selectively pick massive chunks of metal armor for small areas to cover? If endurance is the main concern, limb armor is actually a lot more exhausting than torso armor. I've worn leg and arm plate before, and I can definitely tell you it is noticeably more tiring to have that extra weight. Even just gauntlets add quite a bit of weight to the hand, you know, at the end of the lever that is your arm, and yeah, that's certainly more tiring. Light, medium, or heavy armor, on the other hand, to protect your vitals is ironically not as fatiguing, even though it's more mass. Now, it might strain the shoulders unless properly strapped and or used with a belt to distribute the weight more evenly, but overall it's not as big of a deal compared to limb armor. And in history, it was very common to wear body armor only without limb protection. You see that over and over again in various time frames. Body armor and helmets are usually emphasized. Now, gauntlets and forearm protection are definitely useful. They are vulnerable targets in historical combat. I made an entire video about that. Now, as far as the upper arms and shoulders are concerned, they are not targeted as much usually. However, gladiator-style heavy armor on one arm for parrying or catching weapons definitely makes sense. But you know what also protects arms? A shield. Again, like Shad also pointed out, shields can provide a lot of protection without requiring getting bogged down by all this metal or other material on your body, without restricting movement. Now, you still have to work around the shield, of course, so it's still more cumbersome than not using one, but still a high level of protection, and not just passive protection, but also active capability that comes at a fairly little price. Now, the shins, on the other hand, like on this guy, are really not a high priority to armor unless you are using the shield, because any leg strikes are pretty dangerous for the fighter attempting them. In fact, some historical manuscripts deliberately discourage targeting the legs. If they are good at leg voids, in other words, withdrawing the leg while striking to your head at the same time, you're in a lot of trouble. That risk is much more severe if you're targeting the lower legs compared to the upper legs. Now, this is talking about dueling. On the battlefield, it's a different story. In that case, it does make sense to armor the lower legs. In the 16th century, when they made armor thicker to withstand gunfire, there are often 3/4 harnesses used, so that only the thighs and maybe the knees are armored to save weight. So again, that ties into how exhausting limb armor is. Personally, I find Fantasy Barbarians with two-handed weapons more impressive, and the reach of a two-handed weapon can help keep you safe, at least if it's long enough. Quite often they really aren't. Either way, gauntlets would be a good idea. You know, with a two-handed axe, for example, the hands can be really quite exposed because there are no guards of any sort. And in all fairness, partial armor is arguably better than none because it still removes or restricts available targets. As said, body armor doesn't actually encumber you all that much, so if you're going to wear limb protection, you might as well combine it with body armor to begin with. So, what about the male bikini? So, obviously you have a problem of why even bother with so little armor when the majority of your body is exposed, including your vitals. This stuff really does not protect your heart very well, for example, or your lungs. Also, it looks like there's no padding underneath. 2 words.
Nipple chafing.
That would not be very pleasant, and you know what wouldn't be pleasant either? Being hit on that without having any kind of padding underneath, because that means that you still absorb the brunt of the blunt force, and that can still break bones underneath the mail. So this is just doubly terrible. Not only is it very, very oddly limited protection, on a few spots, it also doesn't really do much of anything, arguably. It's even worse when you think about how mail turns a blade and deflects it because the blade can't bite into it, and then the blade goes elsewhere. So guess what? If it glances off the rack, it's gonna go somewhere else, probably into the body. So yeah, it's just a horrible choice all around. You're literally better off fighting naked. Completely naked. Then there's the point of partially naked or otherwise unarmored warriors in parts of the real world. Now, just one thing that people are often unaware of, which is they used to wear armor in pre-colonial times before encountering guns. For example, native warriors in the Americas used to have armor until they found out that it's not effective against firearms. And in fact, it may actually be smart to ditch clothing too entirely, because bullets can drag cloth into wounds and cause infection and make it even worse. So technically, if you're shot when you're naked, you probably have a higher chance of surviving it than if you're clothed. I've done some tests where I shot historical metal armor, and sometimes bits of the steel are being pushed into the wound, which can make it even worse. To be fair, it also absorbs some of the force, but that might then just make the difference between a full penetration and the bullet being stuck in the body with all kinds of stuff, which is arguably even worse. Either way, there are several examples of this, like Aztec eagle warriors, which were really impressively well equipped. And if you look at other places in the world, same over in Oceania, Kiribati armor, for instance, is really nothing to mess around with. And some cultural groups in Africa used plenty of armor in pre-colonial times. The warriors from the Bornu Empire were well equipped. Here's a leather and iron cuirass, which looks actually quite similar to certain styles of Japanese armor. Here is Nubian armor from the 10th century, and there were other types of reinforced quilted fabric armor. Makes me wonder how they were able to tolerate the heat and all that. So overall, we're like, funny how these people fought unarmored after encountering firearms. We've never seen that before, right? To be fair, from what I found, sub-Saharan warriors generally wore no armor, but like Shad mentioned, again, they had large shields. So in summary, fighting in leather loincloths does fit the barbarian theme, and it makes sense for them to want to show off not only their rippling muscles, but also their bravery and fighting spirit. Fighting in giant pauldrons and male bikinis, on the other hand, I think even other barbarians should laugh at that. It's just, even within that setting, in that context of the fantasy world, that just doesn't seem to make sense. That's just my opinion. So, hope you found it entertaining. Thanks for watching, and have a good one, folks.